Newcastle United were beaten 1-0 by Brighton on Saturday in a result that changes the entire outlook at the start of the season. In this video I'm going to look at the tactical issue that Eddie Howe is facing and how to fix it. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to another analysis video of another Premier League game, another Premier League defeat for Newcastle, the second of the season, the first at St James's Park since January, and it was a really difficult one to take. I had a weekend off, I was in Manchester, so I didn't watch the game, but I have seen the highlights and spoken to people who were there. My brother was there. I'm kind of a bit conflicted about how to react to this game because the performance by all accounts was good, particularly in the first 35 minutes. They were on top. They finally looked like they were good in possession. They tactically had Brighton where they wanted them. They were creating chances. Chances were missed, obviously. We know that Anthony Gordon and Alexander Isak had good opportunities to score and win the game for Newcastle. The sucker punch came when Danny Welbeck scored in the first half, and from then Newcastle gradually lost momentum and ultimately succumbed to a first home defeat of the season. And it really does, as I said in the intro, change the outlook at the start of the season. You know, Newcastle have played really poorly at times this season, but won games, and they were having the best start to a season. I think it was after Wolves, it was the best start to a season since 1995. Suddenly, now it looks distinctly mediocre, and actually performances, while getting better since Manchester City at home, they played fairly well at Everton, and again here, there's progress in terms of the way and the style of Newcastle's play. The fact is that the results aren't there, and it's costing them. And now there's a lot of pressure on three really, really crucial but also difficult games before the international break, where the questions over Eddie Howe's future, I don't want to say that Eddie Howe is under pressure from fans, and there's a growing Eddie Howe out movement among the fans. As I've alluded to in previous videos, I don't think that steadfast denial of any threat to Eddie Howe's job is there from the fan base anymore. I think people are starting to understand that if things don't improve, because the same issues are happening and because lots of deep-rooted problems are to be looked at after these results, then, you know, potentially Eddie Howe's future is going to be up for debate. Obviously, there are big questions about the direction of Newcastle United since Amanda Staveley departed, with Paul Mitchell and all of that sort of stuff that we go into. I mention it pretty much every week now, and I think that's kind of indicative of what Newcastle United is facing at the moment, is that all of these issues can be traced back to a disappointing summer, to difficult decisions that Newcastle have made in the past regarding recruitment, both in and out. And, you know, 2 years ago when they finished fourth, Miguel Almiron was on the right-hand side playing really, really well. So the idea that Newcastle haven't strengthened or haven't had a presence on that right-hand side, it's currently Jacob Murphy, and I'll get into that in a minute, why I think he's a weakling. But 2 years ago, Miguel Almiron had a fantastic season. He was not only scoring more goals than he ever had before in terms of a purple patch, 11 goals that season, but he was really proactive alongside Kieran Trippier, really energetic, really his game really came on, and he's not really hit those heights since. Obviously, he's now very much on the periphery of things. Jacob Murphy's never brought a similar sort of presence. That's an issue on the right-hand side. And Callum Wilson obviously not being fit, not coming off the bench to score goals as he was in that second half of the season. So even though the quality of the squad may be slightly better on paper than it was 2 years ago, actually the makeup of the squad and the fact that context around it, you know, Kieran Trippier as well has dropped off since then. Lots of things are not working for Newcastle that they used to, and this is where I get into the crux of my argument with Eddie Howe. Tactically, I think he's a bit too rigid, but I think there's a bigger principle about coaching that he is missing. You know, when he came in at Newcastle, he was ahead of the time. He was really doing things that we hadn't seen him do at Bournemouth before. He'd gone away and learnt, and we got a lot of credit for that when Newcastle finished fourth and got into the Champions League, for the way he'd you know, done a lot of things to work on himself and found different ways. But I think he's fallen behind a little bit since then. I think there is a problem with the way he manages the team in terms of setup and reacting in games. You know, like, so for example, the substitutions in the Brighton game on Saturday, Sandro Tonali off at 65 minutes, which really felt pre-planned and it was going to happen regardless. And Bruno Guimaraes and Anthony Gordon coming off for Almiron and and Longstaff, that really didn't help change the system, change anything to get Newcastle back into the game. And I think that there's a problem that Eddie Howe has in that he is wedded to a system, and it's more a thing about him being a systems manager, when actually I think the key to coaching, as it's become more apparent in the last few years, is it's less about systems these days and more about principles. Manchester City are a prime example of this. Pep Guardiola is always one step ahead because he changes system. Since last season, Josko Gvardiol plays left back now, and that was never the plan when he was signed. He was signed as a centre back. The system changed when that became a key thing. He's done the same thing with Nathan Ake. He's done the same thing with Rico Lewis, playing Rico Lewis in the centre of midfield. But so there's lots of individual tactical tweaks that Guardiola makes, and he's often changing the way that football is played through the box midfield that became popular last season, because he was the one who brought in the idea of fullbacks transitioning into midfield, made it quite common. You look at Bayer Leverkusen last season, Xabi Alonso had a certain way of playing. There were certain things that he did, overloads out wide, playing through the lines, high press, winning the ball back. But the system changed and at times, and he made reactions in games to win. And that's why Bayer Leverkusen was so productive and so effective at winning games late on. It became a thing that they had great comebacks and won in the last minute quite often because they were reacting in game, whereas Eddie Howe is wedded to 4-3-3. He's wedded to that way of playing regardless of who's in the system. And that was evidenced by the fact that Tonali came off, Bruno came off, and the system didn't change. And what makes that system work is the midfield being good in possession or either good in possession or good with intensity, regardless. So depending on what you're aiming to do. Last season it was the same issue. When he had an injury crisis, he had Joe Willock and Joe Linton out. He tried to play that same open midfield that would press high and win the ball with Louis Miley and Sean Longstaff. And I remember a question that he faced in the press conference about Joe Linton, a sort of lack of attitude and lack of the dark arts that Newcastle had 2 seasons ago. Why didn't they have it last season when Joe Linton was out of the team? He said, well, the makeup of the team is the players, really. The players dictate the style, the players dictate the attitude. But that doesn't really work when you're then changing Bruno Guimaraes and Sandro Tonali out, not changing the system to find a new way to break the team down. So I think what he needs to decide on is have some core principles, whether it be pressing, whether it be overloads out wide, like I said earlier, whether it be possession, whether it be playing through the middle, playing out, getting crosses in, that sort of find your principle of the way you want to play and then build systems around the principles rather than the other way around. And I think that's the big problem I have with Eddie Howe at the moment, is that it's too rigid, it's too pre-planned, it's not different enough, there's nothing to alter. The same mistakes that keep happening in games. You've seen so many times again on Saturday, between the lines, Jorginho Ruta picking up space in the same way that Emile Smith-Rowe did at Fulham earlier this season, Morgan Gibbs-White did last season. Lots of these issues that keep coming up, and I think it's because Eddie Howe is wedded to a certain system, not necessarily the ideals and the principles that he has, that he wants his team to have, because that's what Newcastle were 2 seasons ago. They could tell what their identity was because they were good at pressing. They were extremely good defensively. They look now like a team that plays the same way regardless of who's on the pitch, and that will make them very easy to deal with in certain games, even at home. That's what people have banked on with Newcastle, is that they'll be really energetic and really difficult to handle at St James's Park. But I think this is kind of the issue, that a lot of things have been in the last couple of years with Eddie Howe and with Newcastle generally. Lots of people have excused things, rightly at times, because of the fatigue in the European football last season. They were legitimate issues and mitigating circumstances at times. But people said, once the European football's out of the way, it'll get better. It didn't get better at the second half of last season, really. There wasn't that return to that intensity. Once the players are back from injury at the start of this season, it'll get better. It didn't. Once Sandro Tonali's back, it'll get better. It didn't. Oh, the same thing will happen to Aston Villa. Certainly at this stage, and admittedly, it isn't at the same corresponding stage when it started to go pear-shaped for Newcastle, but early on at this stage, Villa look a lot better and look more able to deal with these issues with the midweek game. Look a lot more able and a lot better, in a better position to react to these things and deal with these things in Newcastle. You even look at Villa, like they're an intense team. They play different ways though, because they have something different on the bench that changes the system. John Duran comes on sometimes with Ollie Watkins and they play together, or Ollie Watkins goes wide, it works because there's a difference. The team still looks like an Unai Emery team. You still know what they're going to do. They're still going to do the same things, but they have a different way of playing because the principles are ingrained, but the styles change. That's what Eddie Howe needs if Newcastle are to progress, because coming up is a couple of really difficult games. You've got Chelsea away next week, who they lost yesterday at Anfield, but they've been in a resurgent form this season after a couple of difficult years where they've been mocked really for a lot of transfer decisions that they've made. But actually, Enzo Maresca, to his credit, is forming a really impressive team out of the players he's inherited. Nicholas Jackson looks really good. Noni Madueke looks really good. Cole Palmer, obviously, maintaining those levels, but he's got better players around him, and it's really showing. Arsenal then come to St James's Park. They lost against Bournemouth at the weekend. That's going to be a really difficult game for them, but it's also going to be a really difficult game for Newcastle. Then there's Nottingham Forest, who I've said previously are in a really good shape as well. So it's really difficult to see if they don't get enough points out of those games, how Eddie Howe will deal with that sea change, because there will be a sea change. There will be a change in the atmosphere around, probably internally, but also externally as well. There'll be a lot of discussion going into that international break about his future if Newcastle have had a tough run on top of an existing tough run. I think it's 5 games without win now. So that great start to the season on paper is no more. It now looks like a pretty mediocre one. There's 5 points behind Villa already. And yeah, there's a lot of these issues. I think actually overall I still do understand the idea that Newcastle played better. There was progression, and if Alexander Isak was match fit, that touch in the first half would have been better. He probably would have scored that goal. Newcastle might well have gone on to win the game. And there is that argument, and that Isak will get fitter, Newcastle will get better. But at the same time, I just think the second half with those substitutions and that lack of difference, and it goes back to quite a deep-rooted issue with Eddie Howe, and I think ultimately he needs to become more principle-based rather than system-based. Otherwise, Newcastle might well struggle going forward, and there will be more calls about his future. I'm not certainly saying Eddie Howe should be sacked at all. I think he's got enough credit in the bank, but it's not even about credit in the bank. It's about quality and ability to get Newcastle out of this rut, and I think he can do that because he has done it in the past. He was the one who got them out of the rut in the second half of his first season. He was the one who found the way to make Newcastle a really robust, difficult team to play against in that season when they finished 4th. Newcastle can get back to that, but I think he needs to decide on principles and the way he wants to play and build systems around that ultimately. Otherwise, Newcastle will become even more stale. The game like Brighton will happen more often, and Newcastle will continue to stagnate. There's got to be a big moment coming, because it's okay to develop and grow and be a work in progress, but 3 years into the takeover process, that's not what the owners really want. There's got to be a big moment coming. I think if Eddie Howe wants to be part of the next stage, he needs to learn to adapt. And as I say, principles over systems is what's needed. Thanks very much for joining me on this video. Like, share and subscribe. And I'll be back next time with another one. Catch you later.